So, it's our gift day today, and more about that a bit later on. We have that once a year. But this is the 5th week now in a series that I've been doing on the subject of the art of navigating life. And I was thinking about that. I thought, well, that's really what every week is about here. How do we navigate our way through life? But we're having a particular course on that. And in previous weeks, we've looked at the idea of the golden thread, a connection with the divine that we use to follow our path through life, one that leads us to respond appropriately to circumstances that comes our way. If we're in touch with that divine, that golden thread, then we're able to respond in an appropriate way. And I said the evidence that we found that golden thread in our lives is when we feel a peace in our hearts, no matter how difficult the circumstances. That's, described as the peace that passes all understanding. Then we looked at the idea of the channel of peace that St. Francis speaks about in his prayer, which begins, "Make me a channel of your peace." By arriving at that place of peace, we then become the channel. We also spoke about the difficulty we have in life that comes from our perception of opposites, thinking that we have to choose one or the other. But in reality, opposites fulfill each other rather than compete. We don't have to choose, but contain the opposites in our lives. Because, what we think about being opposites, that we have to choose between, male and female, sweet and sour, left and right in politics, are also really just on the same spectrum. We know that the spectrum is one that's inextricably interconnected. So there's a connectedness about those opposites. And we're connected, and therefore what we do impacts on both the light around us and on the darkness around us. And that's what we were talking about last week. We can affect the darkness directly with our own actions because we're connected to that. And if you want to listen to any of those previous ones, a little red card in front of you will give you an idea of how to get that. And if you want to be in our mailing list, then there's the blue card. So today, what I want to talk about is navigating the conundrum that on the one hand, from a spiritual perspective, we're told that we're all one, all part of a consciousness that's inclusive. And yet our experience tells us that we're separate. You've got those two things. Everybody, all the gurus get and say, yeah, you're all one. And it's that all one consciousness. But we feel terribly separate. And how do we square these seemingly different perspectives? And how do we use them to navigate through life? I told you that I'm reading this book by Ian McGilchrist, A Matter of Things. And he says about this, everything is a part of one whole, connected to every other part by a matter of degree. But everything is also absolutely unique, has an intense individuality. The apparent conflict between self and no self parallels that between the one and the many, between changelessness and an eternal flow. When people say to me, all is one, I readily agree. And all is many. I add, now what? As Zen Master Suzuki says, the secret of Soto Zen is yes, but. The claim that all is one is well-intentioned, but it seems to me disastrous because it's just a half-truth. We sense that we're not as separate as our everyday manner of thinking applies, and that's wonderful. But the impulse to simplify causes problems, because the other equal truth is that all is many. And he says, I would suggest that this attempt to have it one way or the other comes from the left hemisphere of the brain. He's very big on the left and right hemisphere. And he says the left hemisphere's urge to resolve what it sees as being a contradiction. In Buddhism, writes Jane Hirschfield, non-duality is not the negation of multiplicity in favor of some idea of the absolute. It is not also nihilism that so many Westerners think Buddhism to be. So, as I said, McGilchrist talks about the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And the left hemisphere of our brain wants to represent what's going on in life. That's what the left hemisphere does. It represents what's going on in life. It takes from the senses and represents reality to us in our minds. However, the right hemisphere of the brain is not so much interested in representing reality, representing it to us, as appreciating the presence of reality. So the right hemisphere of the brain appreciates the presence of reality. And in the case of that idea of non-duality and duality, the left brain is more interested in how things work, and the right side of the brain is more interested in the wholeness. So we have both those bits, the bit that thinks that we're separate, and also the bit that appreciates us as being whole. And the key thing, obviously, is to realize that we need both to navigate our way through life. And as I was reading that, I was reminded of that passage from the Upanishads, which also posits the wholeness and the individuality. I've read this before, but like two birds of golden plumage, inseparable companions, the individual self and the immortal self are perched on the branches of the self-same tree. The former tastes of the sweet and bitter fruits of the tree. The latter, tasting neither, calmly observes. The individual self, deluded by forgetfulness of his true identity with the divine self, bewildered by his ego, grieves and is sad. But when he recognizes the worshipful Lord as his own true self and beholds his glory, he grieves no more. Seeing him present in all, the wise man is humble, puts not himself forward. His delight is in the self. His joy is in the self. He serves the Lord in all. So in the Upanishads, it has that idea, left brain, right brain, the small self, the ego, the big self, the two together. And we have to hold, I think, both realizations within our minds and our hearts in order to properly navigate life. To see our lives from that perspective of being an individual on its own. If we just think we're an individual, it robs us of the understanding of our true nature as a whole. And it leads to selfishness and narcissism. And we can see that everywhere in the world, that selfishness and narcissism, which is the individual self, thinking that that's all it is. But to see the self as just from the perspective of the whole, if you just see it from that way, it's like losing your arms and legs. We're no longer any use in the world if we deny our individual ability to have an effect. Now, that may seem obvious, but there are many people who live in one worldview and deny the other. To live in both is to hold the paradox of life and yet still make a meaningful contribution. Cynthia Bourgeault, who often hear says about this non-duality, the egoic selfhood does not go away. Rather, it becomes a good servant. It is a very useful tool for many of the functions we are called on to perform in this world, but is now transcended and included. We recognize that it is a modality of action, not the seat of our identity. It's a lovely idea, the idea that the ego is a modality of action rather than the seat of our identity. And that wholeness is the seat of our identity, but we still have that modality of action. And, so far so obvious, really. But the trick in the way we navigate life is to straddle both perspectives and operate from them at the same time. And that's less easy. To say all is one when a man is coming towards us armed with a knife and not to respond is stupidity. You have to respond to what's going on in the circumstances of your life. Just as it's stupid to ignore our personal responsibility to the whole when we're dealing with global issues like climate change and world hunger. We have to take responsibility for that. And Jesus advocated both perspectives. You know, when he was talking about the wholeness, he said, the kingdom of heaven is within you, the idea that we contain that wholeness. And he said, and he described it beautifully. He said, I am in the Father, I am in that wholeness. You are in me, you are in my experience of you, and I am in you. I am in your experience of me. So he describes that wholeness and is comfortable with that idea of wholeness. But he also is comfortable with the idea of individual action. And I used that quote last week. Don't think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set man against his father, and daughter against her mother, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies would be those of his own household. Which, you know, is very much a sort of individual, egoistic perspective. And so Jesus holds both those perspectives. So, you know, which one to use, one, and when do you use the other? Well, you know, we do have to use both at the same time. We have to live within that context of oneness and use our tool of the individual nature. And it's a bit like that sailing analogy. You know, we have to be aware, we have to have a hand on the tiller, and we have to be aware and keep our eyes open for the movement of the wind and the movement of the currents. You have to be aware of both at the same time. And that's what it is to live consciously in the present moment. You have to be aware of yourself, ourselves through our body, and we have to be aware of the whole that we are part of. And we use both in that process of navigation. And it does require an enormous amount of attention. On a micro level, to live as an individual within our family, we have to experience ourselves as an individual, but we also have to be aware of the needs of our family and work out what we need to sacrifice as an individual for the greater good of the whole. On a community level, it takes an individual, you know, from our community. We have to be individuals within our community, but we also know that we have to give back. I'll use this as a shameless plug for Gift Day, saying that we are going to have Gift Day, but you do need to take responsibility for giving back. You know, if you feel that you get value from being part of a community, then you have to do what sustains that community. And on a national level, you know, we want to live good lives, but when is it right to put our heads above the parapet and to take responsibility for future generations? You've got the individual that wants it nice and secure, but when do we put our head above the parapet and take responsibility, even if it means difficulty for us as individuals? And on a global level, you know, we want warm houses, smart cars, and plenty to eat, and to live in safety. But when we see the world crying out for a change that prioritizes the planet's climate emergency, and that people in the world need food more than they need a vast defense budget, it demands another approach rather than just prioritizing our own comfort. All the time we're facing these challenges and being asked to square the circle of the good of the individual as opposed to the good of the whole. But really, you know, it isn't a choice, because the good of the whole actually leads to the good of the individual. And it's up to us as seeing and thinking individuals to work towards that. Not just for us to be wealthier and safer and more comfortable, but working for a world that is safer and wealthier and more comfortable. If we work for a world to be that, then as individuals we will receive that. We have to prioritize the good of the whole over our individual needs, while at the same time using our resources as individuals to make that happen. We have to become advocates of a universal perspective and use our individual perspectives to support that. And of course, that involves sacrifice. But not sacrifice in the way we think of it. We think of sacrifice as giving something up. of doing without so that others can have instead of us. But that's not the meaning of sacrifice. Sacrifice comes from two Latin words, sacre, ficio. Sacre, which means holy, and ficio, which means to make. We get the word sacred from that. Sacrificio actually means to make holy. That's the true meaning of sacrifice, is where you make something holy. And I think in order to square that circle between the needs of the individual and the needs of the whole, the way we do that is to make our lives holy. Then it's not a conundrum. Then we're living in a different place. To see that in the context of sacredness, we're led in the right direction. When Jesus dies, it says in the Bible that the veil of the temple was rent in twain. Now, the veil of the temple was sort of a bit of carpet, probably, that hung at the door of the temple, and it defined that which was sacred, which was the stuff in the temple, and that which was profane. Literally mean profanum, pro, outside, farnum, the temple. Profanum, profane comes from the word outside the temple. So in the old days, you had that which was profane, which is everything else, and that which was sacred in the temple. And the meaning of the fact that the veil of the temple was rent in twain when Jesus died was a signification that everything was sacred. It wasn't just that which was inside the temple. Everything was sacred. Jesus' death represented the abolition between the sacred and the profane. That the temple was really life itself. And that by living our lives in service to the divine, as Jesus did, our lives become holy. And that's how we square that circle. It's to live life in an attitude of prayer. That's how we live for both the individual and for the whole. And if you think, well, how do I live life within an attitude of prayer? Jesus actually gave us the prayer that enables us to do that. And, I've said this before, I'm a big advocate of the Lord's Prayer. And for me, the information in the Lord's Prayer is that which enables us to put ourselves in exactly the right place to live a sacrificial life, a sacred life. And, going through the Lord's Prayer, it describes the whole experience of what it is to be in sacred life. It starts off, Father of us. And that acknowledges the existence of the divine. Father of us acknowledges that existence of the divine. The one who is in the heavens. In other words, the divine is within everything that is here. Father of us, the one who is in. Hallowed be your nature. And the attitude we should have is one of hallowing, of one of being completely respectful that we're living within that divine nature. And then, may your kingdom come. It's saying, I'm not about making this about me. I'm saying, look, let me be part of your kingdom come in the world. May your will be done as in heaven, so on earth. As in that divine nature. Let me be part of bringing that into the world. It's that attitude. Give us this day that which gives our whole life meaning. Enable us to see that we are living in that divine nature. That we are a part of that. Father of us, the one who's in the heavens, hallowed be your nature. May your kingdom come. May your will be done as in heaven, so on earth. Give us this day our bread from above that gives our whole life meaning. We want to live within that meaning. Cancel our debts as we cancel the accounts of those indebted towards us. May I be a forgiving person. May I not get wrapped up in all the awfulness of judgmentalness that goes on. And let me not be led into temptation, but rescue us from evil. And let me, walk on the water of life so that I don't get caught up in that whole drama of selfishness. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours. It's like giving over to that nature within ourselves, now and forevermore. There's a sense of the eternal within that. And if you can live within that all those values that are expressed there, that is what it is to live a sacred life, to be aware of that as we go through our lives. And, I use the Lord's Prayer in the mornings when I do my meditation, because I remind myself that is the context that I'm living my life. That is what enables me to live a sacred life, a sacrificial life, if I'm aware of all of that. So to live within that context is to make our lives holy, to literally sacrifice our lives, to make our lives holy. And in doing that, we realize that it's not up to us to choose what to do. We don't have to work it out, but to offer our lives to that divine nature and then to listen to the promptings of the heart. You have to listen to those promptings. You have to be aware of the circumstances, hand on the tiller, looking at the winds, looking at the currents, the circumstances that are going on. How do we adjust it? How do I feel my way through life? We realize that it's the promptings of the heart that guide us. They tell us, given all the circumstances, what is the most compassionate thing that I can do here? It is to live life by those promptings of the heart rather than our egoistic minds. And then to use our minds in service of the heart. And that's how we navigate our way through life in the individual and living within the whole at the same time. Did you write that yourself? Fantastic. Composer as well. Isn't that amazing? Absolutely fantastic. Great. So we always have an opportunity for you to come back to what I've said and disagree or make a contribution or share an experience. Sometimes we just have a nice bit of silence. Is anybody like to make a contribution, say anything, or share an experience at all? Yes, Bruce and then Andy. Thank you.
A quote, a concept, and a question. Kierkegaard was the guy that said, you can only understand life looking backwards. Unfortunately, you have to live it going forwards. So, and the concept is midlife transition, where a lot of people at some point have been just doing what their family told them to do. I mean, this is our narrative. This is what you relive our family script, just do it better, type of thing. So everybody buzzes away and then sort of asks, is this all? And they sort of turn around, look at the gold, try to figure out the golden thread and try to become more authentic in their second half of their life. The question is, our brains are wired for 20,000 years ago when you didn't have to navigate life. At 13, you didn't have to decide what you wanted to be when you grew up. You were just part of a collective, very simple kind of context. And I look today at lots of our youth that, are just overwhelmed. The idea of, here's a book on how to design your life, it's not working. And, any thoughts as far as, you've got a couple of kids in college?
Yes, I think it is interesting. One of the things that we've lost is that whole sense of a rite of passage in going into manhood. And Richard Rohr set up a whole thing to enable men to go through a rite of passage to go into manhood. But we don't have that. In the old tribes, they used to, send them out into the wilderness to, kill a sheep or whatever it was, and they'd come back. They have to face their deaths. That was the idea. You face your death and you come back in a new sort of way. And in Richard's thing, I did one myself, and you have to go out for 8 hours alone. It wasn't that uncomfortable because nothing's going to really happen to you because stuff like that. But you still have to be on your own for 8 hours.
So it wasn't in the jungle with
It was in I can't remember. It was in in somewhere where you couldn't see anybody else. They spaced you out, so you were on your own for 8 hours in this place. But I think we've lost something in that idea. Women evolve into menstruation, and so therefore there is a rite of passage in a funny sort of way there. But with men, it's very much more difficult, I think. There's that new Netflix film Adolescence, which talks about the difficulty of men talking to their children. And I think it is more difficult now that we just stream our way into life, literally in all senses of that word. And I think it does require a waking up point, and I think we're lacking that at the moment. Yeah, thank you. Andy.
I like the way Cynthia talked about the ego as like a mechanism for action, something like that. And I was watching Sunday Morning this morning, and Kenny Chesney was being interviewed. I don't know how many country fans we have, but he was being very honest about how much courage it takes to get up in front of 60,000 people and perform a concert. And he said, that's my ego. My ego gets me to do that. But he said, I don't want that all the time. So after the show is over, I want to leave that behind. I don't want to be that. So I thought it was interesting. It's very similar to what Cynthia's saying. Like, your ego's great if it gets you out and gets you to do stuff, but you don't have to be that all the time.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. Anybody else?